They are the most vulnerable victims.
I felt hurt because no one believed me.
Of an unspeakable crime.
Where would you rank protecting children as a priority for law enforcement?
Should be number one.
Tonight, we expose a failure to protect the children of Maricopa County.
This was a decision made by the sheriff.
And follow the money and manpower that was supposed to solve child sex crimes as it was diverted to the sheriff's pet projects.
How could you let this happen?
Let's go.
CBS 5 investigates Sheriff Arpaio's SVU. Maricopa County Sheriff Joe Arpaio calls himself the toughest sheriff in America. But for years, his commanders looked the other way as hundreds of child sex crimes fell through the cracks, leaving rapists on the streets and victims waiting for justice. We're driving through the West Valley, looking for a man accused 8 years ago of raping a young girl. This Maricopa County Sheriff's Office report lays out the case. A sexual assault, a suspect, but no arrest. The case listed as inactive since 2005. The suspect lives here, but we can't show you his face or his name because investigators never finished their work.
We're doing a story about a sheriff's office investigations into child sex crimes.
Is he guilty? We don't know. It's just one of hundreds of cases detailed in these stacks of documents, released only after CBS 5 threatened to sue the sheriff's office. But they're not just cases. They are children whose rapes went uninvestigated for years.
Do you understand why it took so long?
No.
Children like Sabrina Morrison, just 13 years old when her uncle raped her for the first time.
He threatened me, said not to tell anybody, or he would hurt me.
She told her teacher, who called MCSO. But after taking the report and performing a rape exam...
Well, what was the message you walked away with?
I was told straight to my face there was no evidence of any trauma, no sexual assault.
It was 5 years before detectives arrested Sabrina's uncle. 5 years of repeated rapes. 5 years of her parents thinking she was just making it up.
How do you feel when you find out that your daughter's been telling you the truth and you didn't know it?
According to MCSO's own reports, the case sat inactive, even though investigators had the DNA evidence they needed to make an arrest.
An 8th grader could have solved this case.
Charles Serrano is Sabrina's attorney.
There are no good excuses. There are only bad excuses for this type of unconscionable neglect.
Why this case and hundreds of others like it were set aside is a question that has dogged the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office and the sheriff for years.
Sheriff, your department has nearly 500 cases of child sex crimes that they did not investigate.
Well, let's not talk about other issues, which we will resolve.
Sheriff Arpaio has refused to discuss the issue, much less answer questions. But as time went on, the full scope of the problem began to reveal itself. More than 500 cases spanning the years 2004 through 2008, most of them in tiny El Mirage. But both the West and East Valley also had victims whose cases went uninvestigated. While this was happening, the sheriff made headlines and gained popular support, creating a human smuggling unit and conducting immigration raids and roundups.
We're going to continue to enforce the illegal immigration laws.
A review of Arpaio's news releases in 2008 shows 48 of them focused on illegal immigrants, just 3 focused on child rapes. Meantime, MCSO received reports of 360 child sex crimes that year.
They weren't investigating these reports because they were dedicating resources somewhere else.
Paul Charlton is a former United States attorney and 16-year federal prosecutor who worked child sex crimes cases. He says focusing limited resources on headline-grabbing operations produces negative consequences for more important police work.
What happened here was a policy decision to dedicate resources to go after illegal aliens and leave other more serious offenses understaffed and without sufficient resources.
In 2008, an internal investigation began within the walls of the sheriff's office, meant to find out what was happening to the child sex crimes cases. Answers, maybe, but getting access to it would take years.
They dragged this thing out until the election was over.
Coming up next, what we had to do to get those records. Then,
how come you don't want to talk to us about the child sex crimes case?
We take our questions to Sheriff Arpaio. A team of internal affairs investigators within the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office was working to figure out why so many child sex reports were ignored. What they found, they kept secret for more than 4 years.
We knew an investigation was underway, but when we asked about it...
Have you found out what went wrong with the child sex crimes that fell through the cracks?
I'm not going to answer that.
We got no answers.
When will that internal investigation be done, Sheriff?
Anybody have anything else?
What detectives had found was anybody's guess. By 2012, the internal investigation had been going on for 4 years. CBS 5 sent public records request after public records request. The response was always the same. The investigation is ongoing, so you can't have it. In the beginning of 2013, we hired attorney David Bodney to demand the release of the report.
There is no conceivable basis for withholding this investigatory report from public inspection as long as they did.
After Bodney set a deadline of Monday, February 11th, the Sheriff's Office finally released its 10,000-page investigation. It painted a picture of a sex crimes unit that was severely understaffed. Detectives discarded difficult cases, took evidence home with them, and failed to keep track of the cases they left open. The report initially blamed the detectives, their sergeant, and a lieutenant, but in the end concluded that this was a systemic failure. Nobody was disciplined. But something else caught our attention: the dates on the documents. No work had been done since November of 2011.
The sheriff should have released this investigatory report more than a year ago.
It appears that the Sheriff's Office withheld the report for the entire year of 2012.
These kids are the future.
Which happened to be an election year for Arpaio. It was his closest ever. He spent $7 million and received just 50% of the vote. His opponent raised just $500,000 and received 45% of the vote.
They dragged this thing out until the election was over.
Is an election a legitimate reason to withhold releasing a public record?
An election is not a legitimate reason for withholding the disclosure of a public record.
The internal investigation answered lots of questions about what went wrong, but it also created a few new ones. One of them is what happened to $600,000 in equipment and additional personnel that were supposed to solve the problems within the Special Victims Unit.
They said that I wasn't molested.
They told you that they didn't believe you?
They said nothing came back.
Sabrina Morrison is just one of the hundreds of rape victims whose cases were set aside by an overworked and understaffed Maricopa County Special Victims Unit. A 10,000-page internal affairs investigation blamed detectives, a sergeant, and a lieutenant for the failures. But deep inside the report is testimony that shows these people complained repeatedly about being short-staffed. And in 2006, the County Board of Supervisors approved $600,000 to add a sergeant, 5 detectives, and equipment specifically to handle sex crimes cases against children. But those bodies and resources never made it there. MCSO records show that same year the sheriff created a human smuggling unit that targeted illegal immigrants driving on the county's streets and highways. County supervisors never approved money for that unit. The internal investigation failed to point out who made the decision to divert the resources away from the child sex crimes unit.
That decision is not made by the lieutenant, nor the sergeant, nor the people who work below the sergeant. That decision is made by the sheriff.
Former U.S. Attorney Paul Charlton says local law enforcement leaders suspected for years that the sheriff's office was diverting funds away from felony investigations like sex crimes.
And now those victims of child sex abuse cases are paying the penalty for that diversion of resources.
MCSO refused repeated requests for an on-camera interview.
Chief Sheridan, Lisa, hi. I'm Morgan Loew from Channel 5.
So we caught up to the sheriff's second in command on the sidewalk in downtown Phoenix.
Somebody in your department made the decision to divert 6 detectives away from that unit, and there's no mention of who that was in this report.
Everything's in that 10,000-page report. You need to look at it.
That report does a great job of laying out what happened, but it points to the people who were stuck being short-staffed. There's nobody in there who was a decision maker who was held accountable.
You need to read that report. It's very thorough.
And it says where those detectives went? Because I didn't see that anywhere. Who made the call to divert those detectives? Scott Freeman, did you make that call?
After more than 5 minutes of asking the same questions, the sheriff's public information officer had this to say.
We're talking David Hendershot, okay, who ran the unit, ran the office then. Ask him those questions.
David Hendershot was the sheriff's chief deputy for years, a polarizing figure who resigned 2 years ago. And it was during his tenure that the SVU had its problems. But there is someone else who was above Hendershot in the sheriff's office chain of command.
The failure to sufficiently investigate child sex abuse cases rests on the shoulders of the sheriff.
You think he needs to say something about this?
I think it's right that the sheriff talk about what happened here. I think it's right that the sheriff defend his position.
The normally media-friendly sheriff avoided our questions for nearly 2 weeks until we caught up to him on Thursday night.
How come you don't want to talk to us about the child sex crimes cases?
Read the report. That's it.
Don't you think you have something, you should be saying something about this?
Read the report.
I've read the report, and it blames David Hendershot, but you were Hendershot's boss. How could you let this happen?
Let's go.